I was watching a friend in Hangzhou use the new Quen update last week, and it felt less like a software demo and more like watching a ghost run errands. He didn't open a single delivery app or travel portal. He just muttered into his phone, "I'm heading to the office, get me a latte, and book the 3 p.m. high-speed rail to Shanghai." Usually, this is where the friction starts. The Face ID lag, the search for the right train, the payment pop-ups. But there was none of that. His phone didn't even show the Taobao or Alipay interface. It just stayed on the chat screen, and a few seconds later, a confirmation pinged. Then came the part that actually felt unsettling. The AI placed a real-time voice call to a local noodle shop to check on a specific seasonal dish. Hearing a synthetic voice negotiate with the busy shop owner over the sound of clinking bowls and kitchen chaos was surreal. My friend was ecstatic. He kept calling it digital freedom, saying he was finally escaping the app prison. To him, the fact that he didn't have to see a single banner ad or scroll through endless menus was the ultimate victory. He felt like he had finally regained control over his own time. But then I asked him a simple question. If you aren't looking at the apps anymore, how does Alibaba make money from the ads you just bypassed? His expression shifted instantly. The giddy excitement vanished, replaced by a look of uneasy confusion. He realized that the very thing he loved, the total elimination of friction, was effectively gutting the trillion-dollar business model of the company that built it. That shift, from the triumph of convenience to the realization of a looming corporate crisis, is exactly where the AI race stands today. We've moved past the era of smart chatbots. We've entered execution hell, a brutal phase where the goal is no longer a 60% completion rate for a cool demo, but a 95% reliability threshold that threatens to cannibalize the very platforms providing it. It's no longer about who has the best model. It's about who can survive the transition from a world of browsing to a world of pure execution. And that story, it's not science fiction. It's not some concept video from a design studio.
No. Not long ago, I was talking with this woman, Naomi Hartz. She's a 28-year-old content creator, lives out in LA. And for her, TikTok wasn't just an app. It was basically her whole life.
It was her career, her community.
Everything.
Yeah.
And she described this scene from last year. She called it a digital apocalypse. For 14 hours, the app just went dark across the whole country.
I remember that day. It was chaos online.
Total void. No dance trends, no, skincare tutorials, nothing. And for Naomi, that was really the climax of this 6-year war she'd been fighting.
And she was really fighting it.
Oh, yeah. She flew to D.C. twice, stood on the Capitol steps. She was part of that whole army of influencers, lobbying politicians, save TikTok.
Right.
At the time, it felt like this huge ultimate battle for the soul of the internet, a superpower versus a generation of creators who they just wanted to keep their community.
But then the news finally broke.
Then the news breaks this past Thursday. The deal is signed. The saga is over. And her reaction was,
yeah,
well, it wasn't what you'd expect.
No victory dance.
No victory dance, no celebratory live stream, nothing. Instead, she just sounded hollow. She said she felt this sense of alienation from the platform she fought to protect.
Wow.
Her words were, it felt like just another Tuesday.
After all that,
yeah.
That's incredibly telling.
Isn't it? It's such a bizarre anticlimax to a story that, it involved 2 presidents, the Supreme Court, a $14 billion valuation.
We were told this was about national security. That was a whole justification.
Exactly. Preventing a foreign power from spying on 200 million Americans. But now that the dust is settling on this new American TikTok, the details feel strangely familiar.
Very familiar.
Software giants like Oracle, billionaires like Michael Dell, they've carved up 80% of it. But the Chinese parent company, ByteDance, they quietly kept the one thing everyone actually cares about.
The secret sauce?
The secret algorithm, the code that decides what you see every single time you scroll.
So after 6 years of political grandstanding, of trade wars, influencers crying in Congress, we've landed on a solution that looks almost identical to the one they proposed years ago.
It's unbelievable. And it leaves you with this haunting question. Did we actually solve a national security crisis? Or did we just trade the fear of foreign propaganda for the reality of domestic control?
As one person put it, we might have saved the app, but we ended up exactly where we started. It feels less like a finish line and more like we just woke up in a slightly different reality.
Last summer, I found myself standing at the edge of the Pearl River Delta, watching the sunset hit the Shenzhen-Zhongshan link. It's a 24-kilometer engineering colossus, an intricate dance of bridges, artificial islands, and a massive tube tunnel plunging deep beneath the sea. There's a clinical, almost eerie efficiency to it. 100,000 vehicles will cross it before dawn, moving with the rhythmic pulse of a civilization that has mastered the physical world. It feels like standing in the future. But then I thought about California. Back in 1996, California voters were promised a dream. A high-speed rail that would whisk travelers from San Francisco to Los Angeles at 220 miles per hour. It was supposed to be the American jewel of the 21st century. Fast forward nearly 30 years and $30 billion later, and the reality is a ghost. There isn't a single mile of operational track, just endless piles of legal paperwork, environmental impact reports, and community board transcripts. It's a jarring contrast that goes beyond mere economics. On one side of the Pacific, you have a system run by engineers who optimize for megawatt hours and steel density. A world where the Pearl River Delta produces more industrial output than the entire nation of Italy. On the other, you have a Vitocracy, a system run by lawyers and activists, where every stakeholder has the power to say no, but no one has the authority to say go. That sudden realization that one culture treats infrastructure as a vital sign of life while the other treats it as a legal battlefield left me wondering, are we witnessing a civilizational divergence? This isn't just about trains and bridges. It's about what happens when a society forgets how to build.
Well,
We are entering an era where history won't be written by those with the best arguments, but by those who can actually manufacture reality. While the West deliberates, Asia builds. While lawyers litigate, the cranes keep pivoting.
Wow. That is a very powerful way to frame it. And honestly, it's the only place we really can start this conversation. Imagine the scene at Davos. The air is thin, the suits are expensive, and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney is standing at the podium looking like a man who has just played the winning card. He's speaking with the measured confidence of a leader who believes he has finally outmaneuvered the inevitable. He talks about cracks in the old US-led world order and calls for middle powers to unite against economic coercion. Behind the scenes, he's just finalized a strategic partnership with China, a deal that secures a future for Canadian canola oil and lowers the barriers for Chinese electric vehicles. To the Canadian delegation, it feels like a masterstroke of diversification, a way to finally step out from the long shadow of their southern neighbor. But then the notifications start hitting phones in the room and the atmosphere turns cold. One social media post from Washington flips the entire script. In an instant, Canada's strategic partnership isn't being hailed as a breakthrough. It's being branded as a backdoor for Chinese goods to flood the American market. The reaction isn't just a diplomatic disagreement, it's a total threat of economic isolation. Donald Trump doesn't just suggest a negotiation. He threatens a 100% tariff on every single Canadian product entering the US and pulls Canada's seat from his new peace council. Then comes the line that strips away decades of polite diplomacy. Canada only exists because of the United States. That instantaneous shift from the high of a new world order in the Swiss Alps to the reality of an existential threat from the Oval Office is jarring. It leaves us with a chilling question. Is Canada truly finding its footing on the global stage, or did they just try to open a door that the U.S. is prepared to slam shut with a force that could break their entire economy?
Wow. I mean, that is the geopolitical cliffhanger of the decade, isn't it?
It really is.
And while all the cameras are focused on, the podiums in Switzerland and the social media feeds in Washington, I think we need to completely shift our gaze. We need to look at what is happening at sea level, because to really understand why a G7 nation would risk the wrath of its only neighbor.
I recently spent an afternoon with a man who is, by all public accounts, a paragon of conscious leadership. He's the type of person who quotes Marcus Aurelius in every meeting and spends his weekends at expensive retreats designed to cultivate radical empathy. As we sat in a crowded bistro, he was mid-sentence, speaking with a serene, practiced warmth about the spiritual necessity of seeing the inherent dignity in every person we encounter. Then, a delivery driver, shouldering a heavy thermal bag and looking visibly exhausted, accidentally brushed against his chair while navigating the narrow aisle. The shift was instantaneous. That serene warmth didn't just fade, it evaporated. He snapped a remark about basic competence and situational awareness that was so sharp it felt like a physical strike. The driver mumbled a panicked apology and hurried away, but my companion didn't even pause to reflect. He simply adjusted his cufflinks, took a sip of his sparkling water, and went right back to explaining how kindness is the only true currency of the future. It was a jarring display of cognitive dissonance. He clearly didn't see the contradiction. In his own mind, he was still the hero of his narrative, the wise philosopher of the bistro. But to everyone else in that room, the radical empathy was revealed as nothing more than a costume. Watching him, I realized how easily we mistake our intentions for our identity. We treat our high-minded beliefs like a polished trophy on a shelf, forgetting that character isn't a declaration, it's a demonstration. It is what's left over when the room is crowded, your energy is low, and your patience is paper thin. We like to think we are defined by the stories we tell about ourselves, but the hard truth is that we are only what we do repeatedly, especially when there is no audience left to applaud.
Wow. I mean, that story, it just paints such a visceral picture.
It was uncomfortable to watch.
I bet. And it's uncomfortable because it feels so recognizable, you know?
Yeah.
It perfectly frames this central tension that we're going to be exploring in this deep dive.
Exactly.
It's that huge gap between character as a declaration, all the things we post, the values we say we have, this identity we curate, and then character as a demonstration.
Which is the actual tangible, physical stuff, what you do.
What's left over when the audience is gone.
Yeah. And that moment, that bistro moment, it really stuck with me because it feels symptomatic of a much larger cultural thing that's going on.
It does.
We are living in an era that is just obsessed with the declaration. We optimize our LinkedIn profiles to say the right things. Companies spend, millions on these beautiful mission statements. We're constantly broadcasting our why.
It's all about the story.
It's all story. It's as if saying the right thing has become the same as doing the right thing. But today, we're going to pivot. It's 10:10 p.m. in a luxury banquet hall in Sanya, and the party is already hitting its fever pitch. A group of slightly tipsy revelers stands up, raising their glasses in a thunderous toast to the year 2026. They aren't early to the party, and they haven't had too much to drink. At least not yet. They're simply celebrating on Vladivostok time, honoring the countdown in the Russian Far East while sitting thousands of miles away on a tropical Chinese island. On the beaches outside, the scene is just as surreal. While local police drones broadcast stern warnings against fireworks, they don't actually intervene when Russian vacationers stagger toward the shoreline to launch Roman candles into the South China Sea. Here, the usual rules of international travel seem to have shifted. In a world where the war in Ukraine has forced many Russians to lower their voices and hide their passports in Europe, Hainan has become a sun-drenched sanctuary where they can be as loud as they want. You see it everywhere. There are knockoff Moscow restaurants like Shaihona No. 9 serving borscht and cold vodka. There are local shopkeepers who greet every foreigner with a Russian stressed Volatile instead of a hello. Even the loudspeakers at the beach, controlled by the local government, loop classic Russian folk songs like Kalinka to make the visitors feel at home. But beneath the surface of this tropical friendship, there's a strange, unspoken tension. Take Anton, an IT developer from Moscow. He used to spend his summers in Nice and Monaco, but with EU visas now nearly impossible to get, he's found himself here by default. He's happy for the sun, but he's already hitting a wall. When he tried to ask his Chinese guide about the situation in Taiwan, he was told the topic was too sensitive. Hello. He can talk about the war in Ukraine, but not the politics of the land he's standing on. Between 2023 and 2024, the number of Russian tourists here jumped 11-fold, making them the largest foreign group on the island. It's a massive economic windfall for China, but it raises a deeper question. Is this the start of a genuine cultural fusion, or is Hainan simply the last remaining escape hatch for a nation that has run out of places to go? And that really is the central question for today's deep dive.
In 2018, the scientific world found its new villain. Hedging, the researcher who crossed the ultimate ethical line by creating the world's first gene-edited babies, was universally condemned and jailed for 3 years and forever branded China's Dr. Frankenstein. The expectation was simple. A scientist who commits such a profound transgression must be permanently banished, silenced, and forced into obscurity. That is the standard punishment for scientific heresy. But recently, the reality of Hedging's life post-prison has emerged, and its dramatic, unsettling reversal of that expectation. He is not in hiding. He's not silenced. Instead, he resides in a spacious Beijing apartment provided by an anonymous sponsor, complete with a bodyguard. He is operating out of a government-supported research center, openly boasting about his work and receiving job offers from state-funded medical institutes. When asked about the infamous Frankenstein nickname, the man who was supposed to be a pariah now smiles. He says he likes it because it proves he has superpowers. This is the core contradiction. Why is a nation known for strict control allowing its most infamous scientific criminal to not only walk free, but thrive? The answer, according to those who know him, is that in China's relentless pursuit of biotech dominance, Hedging is no longer seen as a liability. He is now viewed as a potential asset. And that shift changes everything we thought we knew about the future of gene editing.
You know, that phrase right at the end, potential asset.
I was having dinner with an old friend in Shenzhen last month, a guy who made his fortune in the 2010s. For years, his life followed a predictable, almost rhythmic pattern. Every few years, he'd buy a shell, an empty concrete apartment. For the next 6 months, he'd be obsessed. He'd show me photos of premium tiles, debate the merits of German-engineered kitchen vents, and talk about the momentum of the market with a giddy, almost electric energy. He wasn't just buying a floor plan. He was single-handedly activating a massive chain of factories, truckers, and designers. Back then, his savings weren't sitting idle. They were the high-octane fuel for the nation's industrial engine. But this time, the energy was gone. He told me he's playing it safe now. He stopped buying shells. When I asked if he'd stopped spending altogether, he laughed and showed me his phone photos of a high-end ski trip in Xinjiang and a receipt for an expensive omakase dinner. I'm spending plenty, he said, but the rest, it just stays in the bank. It's safer there. On the surface, he looks like the perfect modern consumer. He's moving toward services, enjoying life, and keeping a healthy balance sheet. But there's a quiet structural crisis hidden in that shift that the mainstream headlines completely miss. We're constantly told that the China problem is a lack of spending, that people are simply too scared to open their wallets. But my friend is opening his wallet. The real issue is a profound demand mismatch. For 20 years, housing wasn't just a place to live. It was a unique accounting blind spot that turned private savings into massive physical demand for everything from cement to refrigerators. It was the bridge between the household and the heavy industrial soul of the country. Now that bridge has collapsed. Even as people spend on ephemeral pleasures like travel or dining, they've left a massive echoing void in the real economy. The demand hole left by real estate is so vast you could buy 1 million designer shirts and still not fill it. We are witnessing a fundamental breakage. A state doubling down on building a high-tech manufacturing superpower, while its citizens are retreating into a defensive, low-velocity savings model. It raises a haunting question. If the domestic consumer is no longer buying the output of the modern industrial system, who is this new economy actually for?
That is, I think, the central tension of the entire decade.
I was grabbing coffee last week with an old colleague who recently returned from a technical audit of a dark factory in the Pearl River Delta. He looked genuinely unsettled, but not for the reasons you'd expect. He didn't talk about labor conditions or shipping backlogs. Instead, he described the vibe of the facility, or rather, the lack of one. He told me about standing in a massive, high-precision assembly hall where the lights were dimmed to save energy because the workers didn't need eyes to see. He showed me a grainy video on his phone, something he'd captured during a system diagnostic. It wasn't a sleek PR reel, it was a screen recording of an industrial large model managing a fleet of autonomous logistics bots. At one point, a bot encountered a minor floor obstruction. Instead of stopping or triggering an alarm, the entire grid shifted. Hundreds of units recalculated their paths in a millisecond, a synchronized dance of steel and sensors that looked more like a biological organism than a machine. It wasn't just automation, he whispered. It was like watching a physical brain process a thought. What struck me was the contrast he drew next. He'd just come from a venture capital mixer in Palo Alto where the brightest minds were obsessed with whether AI could write a convincing sitcom script or generate cool digital art. He said the room was buzzing with talk of traffic harvesting and content ecosystems, but when he tried to describe the millisecond-level transformation of code into components he'd seen in China, the way AI was being used to optimize the very arrangement of atoms, people just looked at him with a sort of polite boredom. That disconnect is what's truly jarring. While one side of the world is captivated by the pixels of AI, the other has quietly integrated it into the steel. That instantaneous shift from AI as a toy to AI as industrial sovereignty is no longer a theoretical debate for 2026. It is a physical reality measured in tons and kilowatt hours. It makes you wonder, if the ultimate value of computing power isn't in simulating human conversation, but in mastering the physics of production, have we been looking at the wrong scoreboard this entire time?
That phrase right there, looking at the wrong scoreboard, that's really the only way to frame what we're looking at today.
Right, it just hits you.
It does. And that unsettled feeling your colleague had, that's not just, being spooked by a quiet room full of robots.
No, it was deeper than that.
It's a visceral reaction. It's what happens when you see a fundamental strategic divergence playing out right in front of your eyes. It's the realization that while one part of the world is optimizing for clicks, for engagement, another is optimizing for something much more basic.
For survival.
For physical survival, yeah. The sources we pulled for this deep dive, they all point to this fork in the road, this split in the timeline. I was having coffee with an old friend last week, a senior consultant who spent 30 years overseeing infrastructure projects in Western Europe. He looked exhausted, but he had this triumphant glint in his eye as he slammed a massive leather-bound binder onto the table, beaming. After 8 years of environmental litigation, 3 rounds of union negotiations, and a dozen public hearings that nearly turned into riots, they finally had the permit to upgrade a single pier at one of the continent's major ports. To him, this was a masterpiece of democratic compromise, a hard-won victory for the system. He started explaining the intricacies of the veto points he'd cleared, looking for a nod of approval. Instead, I pulled up a video on my phone that I'd received that morning from a contact in Ningbo. It was a 30-second drone clip of a new, fully automated terminal. There wasn't a soul on the ground. Thousands of containers were being shuffled by AI-driven cranes and silent AGVs with the rhythmic, terrifying precision of a Swiss watch. No strikes, no litigation, no bird-watching lawsuits, just the cold, frictionless conversion of data into physical movement. As the video played, his smile didn't just fade, it evaporated. He looked at the 500-page permit on the table, the physical embodiment of his life's work, and then back at the screen where machine was doing in seconds what his port took hours to coordinate. He muttered something about human rights and the cost of soulless efficiency, but his voice lacked conviction. It was the look of a man who realized he had spent a decade perfecting a typewriter, while the rest of the world was moving to the cloud. That hollow look in his eyes wasn't just about one port. It was the realization of a widening civilizational rift. While we've been busy perfecting the art of no, building a labyrinth of vetoes and procedural hurdles, a new kind of power has emerged. It's not based on who has the best arguments or the most likes, but on who can move atoms as fast as they move bits. It's a shift from the hegemony of discourse to what some are calling flow hegemony, where the ultimate verdict on a civilization isn't found in its ballot boxes, but in the sheer undeniable efficiency of its industrial spine.
Flow hegemony. That's the key. That's the phrase that just ties everything together that we're looking at today.
It really is. I mean, we're staring at this stack of material China's industrial plans for 2026. These theoretical frameworks for something called the physical internet, analyses of Western political paralysis.
And they all point to the same thing. They all point to this massive fundamental shift in what power actually is.
It feels like the ground is moving under our feet. For, 30, 40 years, we've operated under the assumption that power was about controlling capital markets.
Or controlling the narrative, political debate, soft power.
Exactly.
I was recently looking at the headlines and noticed a recurring theme. A bloodbath in the auto industry, politicians fuming about Chinese electric cars sneaking across borders, and a general sense of panic that the U.S. is being outplayed. Everyone seems to have a very strong, very angry opinion about how China suddenly stole the lead in the EV race. But if you step back from the noise and look at the actual timeline, the story gets a lot stranger. Picture 2011. The Chinese EV market wasn't a titan, it was a joke. One of their biggest brands, BYD, had just launched a flagship hybrid and managed to sell a grand total of 11 cars internationally. 11. The government was throwing billions at the problem, but there were no charging stations, the batteries were subpar, and consumers weren't buying the hype. At that moment, the West wasn't worried, they were dismissive. Yet fast forward to today, and 60% of all EVs sold globally are Chinese. Tech giants like Xiaomi companies that usually make your smartphone are now building cars because the profits are too massive to ignore. It looks like an overnight miracle of state-run engineering. The common narrative is that China did this through sheer state power and aggressive isolationism. But there's a much more uncomfortable irony at the heart of this rise. While Western leaders today warn of an existential economic threat, the reality is that the foundation of China's EV dominance wasn't built in a vacuum. It was built with American blueprints, fueled by American investors, and accelerated by U.S. companies that decided China was a better place to innovate than their own backyard. We are currently shouting at a house that we held by the bricks for. Okay, I have to pause right there because I'm still hung up on that number. 11 cars.
I recently stood in a high-end gallery where an aging artist was practically mourning over a fresh canvas. He kept talking about the stench of primitive man, that raw, sweaty, imperfect human touch that he believed gave art its soul. To him, the rise of algorithmic generation wasn't just a technical shift, it was a desecration. He looked at the hyper-precise output of a neural network with a kind of visceral disgust, as if you were looking at a clean, lifeless corpse. To his mind, if the art didn't smell like the struggle of a biological creature, it wasn't art at all. But then I looked at the reality of the global power grid. While he was spending months obsessing over the truth of a single shaky brushstroke half a world away, massive GPU clusters were consuming gigawatt hours of electricity, churning out aesthetic masterpieces based on pure mathematical optimization and computational hyperfrequency. That's when the contradiction became impossible to ignore. We have been raised to believe that the human soul is the ultimate source of beauty. But what if that soul is actually just a romantic label we've placed on our own biological inefficiency? We are currently witnessing what looks like a civilizational autopsy. On one side, there is a Western tradition clinging to subjective feeling and the stench of the past. On the other, a rising paradigm where art is treated as a branch of physics and computing power is the only sovereignty that matters. It is a shift from the artist's studio to the industrial server farm, a transition from romantic individualism to a brutal mathematical purity. It raises a question that most are too uncomfortable to ask. Is the era of human creativity actually ending, or are we simply watching the biological version of art finally go obsolete in the face of a superior engineered reality?
Wow. I was recently talking to a trade attaché from a mid-sized Southeast Asian nation, someone who's, spent his entire career navigating the friction between Washington and Beijing. We were sitting in this glass-walled office looking out over a really bustling port, and he pointed out something fascinating. On one pier, you have a U.S. Navy destroyer docked for a routine port call, a clear symbol of security cooperation. But then, just a few hundred yards away, these massive cranes, branded with Chinese state-owned logos, were offloading crates of telecommunications gear, stuff destined for the country's new 5G network. And he had this slight, knowing smile as he checked his watch and remarked how convenient it was that his country was being courted by both sides. To an outsider, it just looked like a precarious balancing act, or maybe even a slow-motion betrayal of his Western allies. I mean, in Washington, this would be whispered about as a tilt toward Beijing, right? A sign that the U.S. was losing the region. There's this palpable anxiety in the air every time a country like his takes a meeting in China, a feeling that they're one signature away from, switching jerseys and joining the other team. But then he said something that completely flipped the script for me. I asked him, "Are you worried? Worried about the pressure from the U.S. regarding those Chinese tech contracts?" He didn't look worried at all. In fact, he looked energized. He said, "Why would I be?" He asked, "The more the U.S. worries we're leaning toward China, the better the trade terms they offer us to stay. And the more we work with the U.S. on security, the more Beijing lowers its infrastructure interest rates to keep us at the table." And that's when it hit me. We've been looking at the world through the lens of a high-stakes football match where you have to wear either a red or blue jersey. We see every single move as a pivot or a loss. But for the rest of the world, the game has changed entirely. They aren't looking for a new master. They're looking for room to breathe. They aren't choosing a side. They're creating what he called a thread of exit. This isn't a story about a new Cold War. It's a story about the rise of the ultimate insurance policy. Strategic optionality.
Strategic optionality. I once sat down with a retired intelligence officer who described a morning on a carrier deck that felt like the end of the world. A foreign fighter jet had just buzzed their tower, so close the windows rattled in their frames. The younger crew members were practically sprinting to their battle stations, convinced they were about to enter a dogfight. But the officer told me he just checked his watch and went back to his coffee. To him, that pilot wasn't trying to start a war. He was delivering a message. It was a very fast, very expensive way of saying, "We're unhappy with your latest move." We usually view military force as a binary, a simple light switch that's either off for peace or on for war. But for the people in those high-stakes rooms, the military isn't a switch, it's a dial. It's a sophisticated spectrum of intensity and scale where every movement is a calculated piece of statecraft. Think about it. Why does a country spend millions on a routine military exercise right on a disputed border instead of just attacking? Or why does a Navy ship cross a specific invisible line in the ocean only to turn back 10 minutes later? It's because they're operating on a ladder of escalation. Most people only notice when someone reaches the top rung, the total wars and the regime changes. But the real game, the one that actually decides the fate of global trade and borders, is played in the subtle, gray zone rungs in between. If you want to understand how the world is actually run through the barrel of a gun, you have to stop looking at war as a final destination and start seeing it as a language. To truly read the headlines, you have to understand the dimensions of that spectrum, the difference between a symbolic warning and an existential threat.
That story it's the perfect illustration, isn't it? The other day, I was watching a friend of mine, a freelance designer who loves to brag about the freedom of working from home. We were sitting in a cafe, but he wasn't really there. Every few minutes, his eyes would dart reflexively to the bottom right corner of his laptop screen, checking the digital clock. He looked genuinely anxious, almost hunted. When I asked him what the rush was, he couldn't point to a specific deadline or a meeting. He just sighed and said, "I feel like I'm falling behind." It was fascinating to watch. The sun was still high, the coffee was warm, and no one was standing over his shoulder. Yet he was treating those little shifting digits like a demanding supervisor, apologizing to the air for taking a 20-minute break. To him, time wasn't a flow of experience or a natural rhythm of the afternoon. It had become a dwindling resource he was failing to spend correctly. He viewed the clock as a neutral, objective friend, a simple tool to keep his life organized. But there's a subtle, almost invisible violence in that ticking. We've been taught to see the clock as a great achievement of civilization, a way to synchronize our world. We think of it as a mirror reflecting the real time. But if you look closer at how it actually entered our lives, a different picture emerges. Before the clock was a sleek accessory on your wrist or a silent vibration in your pocket, it was an infrastructure of power. It didn't come into the world to help us stay on track. It was designed to produce a version of time that could be measured, sold, and most importantly, demanded from us. That instantaneous shift from the clock being a helper to being a warden is where the real story begins. We stopped living in time and started working for it. Once you realize that the clock doesn't just measure your day, but actually dictates who owns your heartbeat and your focus, you have to wonder, is the clock a tool we use, or is it the technology that governs us?
And that question, that final question right there, is it a tool or is it a governor? That's, I think, the perfect place for us to start this deep dive.
It really is, because it gets to the heart of something we take completely for granted.
I was sitting in a crowded cafe in Taipei recently, and I was watching this group of women, maybe late 20s, just scrolling through their phones. And one of them, she pointed a news headline. It was about the government's latest fertility bonus, a pretty substantial cash payout for every new baby.
Right, the latest attempt.
Exactly. And you'd think there would be some excitement or, at least a bit of cynical hope.
Some kind of reaction.
Nothing. Instead, she just sipped her latte and gave this dry, hollow laugh. And she muttered to her friends, that amount, that won't even cover the motherhood penalty I'll pay at the office for the next decade.
Wow. That's incredibly telling.
It was. And her friends, they didn't argue. They didn't even look surprised. And the data backs this up. More than half of unmarried women in this age bracket now say they have zero interest in ever walking down the aisle.
It's not just a delay anymore, it's a decision.
It's a decision. It's not a protest. It's not some radical political stance. It was just this calm, settled indifference. It's like the traditional milestones of marriage and kids have just been discarded, like an outdated software update.
An optional feature that they're choosing not to install?
Precisely. But here's the part that really stops you in your tracks. While all these officials in Hong Kong and Taiwan are busy printing posters and cutting checks for dragon year babies, the ground is just shifting beneath them.
The numbers are brutal.
In just 6 years, the number of newborns has plummeted. Over 26% in Hong Kong and a staggering 35% in Taiwan. I mean, we are no longer just talking about a low birth rate.
No, this is something else entirely.
We've reached the threshold that sociologists call the fertility trap. It's a point of no return. The numbers drop so low that the society just loses its internal momentum to recover.
It's like falling into a physical pit.
That's the perfect analogy. You fall into this pit, and no matter how much money you throw down to the people inside, they just can't find the leverage to climb back out. So the question is, when the culture itself stops believing in the future, can a government check really buy a new generation?
That image of the pit, that's what's so terrifying. The idea that the walls are too slick to climb back up, it implies that agency has been lost. We're not just discussing a bad year for statistics.
No.
We're looking at the potential mathematical end of two of the most advanced economies in Asia as we know them.
And when you say mathematical end, that's not hyperbole, is it?
I once watched a seasoned therapist, and this is someone who had spent years, teaching the theory of empathy, sit across from a client.
Okay.
This client was struggling with a really deep-seated addiction. And on paper, this therapist was an absolute master. He could recite the stages of change in his sleep.
Right, he had all the conceptual knowledge, knowing that.
Exactly. So as the client starts to describe the, quote, comfort of his habit, the therapist leans in. His face is this perfect mask of professional poise. You could almost see it, the brilliant, multi-layered reflection forming in his mind. He looked like he was ready to deliver a complete masterclass in clinical intuition.
The eloquent mind in action.
That's what I thought. But when he finally opened his mouth, the masterclass it never happened. Instead, what came out was this clunky leading question. It sounded more like a cross-examination than a conversation.
Oh, it's painful to even imagine.
It was. The client's expression just shifted instantly. His eyes glazed over, his shoulders kind of hiked up, and he just retreated into one-word answers.
The connection was severed. Just like that.
Completely. And later, in a debrief, the therapist was genuinely bewildered. He said, I knew exactly what I wanted to say. I've read the books. I know the techniques. In my head, it was perfect.
And that is the core of it, isn't it? That's the eloquent mind versus the stumbling tongue.
It's a perfect display of it. It's this gap that I think most of us in any field really know all too well. It's that frustrating space between being able to explain a theory and being able to actually execute it when a real person is sitting there staring you in the face.
We spend hundreds, maybe thousands of hours absorbing all this conceptual knowledge. We read the manuals, we watch the lectures, and we feel like experts in the quiet of our own thoughts.
Right. In our heads, we're brilliant.
But the moment the ante is upped and we're in that hot seat, that intellectual certainty it often evaporates.
And what are we left with? Awkward pauses and missed opportunities. It's like we think we're mastering the craft by studying the blueprints, but we forget that knowing how a house is built isn't the same as being able to swing the hammer.
And it begs that glaring question you brought up. Why do we expect to be eloquent in these high-pressure sessions when we've only ever practiced in our heads?
It's the defining paradox, right? We have this assumption that if we can think it, if we can articulate it in our minds, our mouths will just follow along. But that's where the stumbling tongue comes in. That chasm between knowing that and knowing how is where most of us fall apart.
And that chasm is exactly the territory we're mapping in this deep dive. I was recently in a small manufacturing town just outside of Seoul, the kind of place you won't see in a glossy K-drama. In a cramped Gozi one of those tiny windowless one-room units, I met a man named Eris. He'd spent 8 years working in a plastics factory, the kind of 3D job that makes your joints ache just looking at the machinery. Eris speaks fluent Korean, knows the local lunch spots better than the regulars, and pays his taxes like clockwork. But when I asked him if he felt like he finally belonged, he just gave me a tired, knowing smile. To the government spreadsheets, he is a vital economic unit. To the legal system, he is a temporary guest on a ticking clock. On paper, South Korea has reached a historic, almost shocking milestone. With over 5% of its population now born elsewhere, international organizations have officially checked the box. South Korea is now a standard immigrant nation. You'll hear officials point to the 1999 border openings and the rise of Damunhwa support centers as proof of a new, inclusive Asian melting pot. There's this narrative floating around that Korea has finally shed its hermit kingdom skin to embrace global diversity. But if you look closer, the math doesn't quite add up. While the headlines boast about 500,000 naturalized citizens, the reality in the immigration offices tells a story of right of blood over right of residency. We are told the country is opening its arms, yet the single largest group of residents, those from China, are often omitted from the diversity conversation to make the nation look more westernized. It leaves you with a strange, lingering question. Is South Korea actually becoming a multi-ethnic society, or is it just a labor importer desperately trying to fill the gaps left by the world's lowest birth rate? We're told the door is open, but for people like Eris, it feels more like a revolving door. Behind the statistics of a standard immigrant nation lies a demographic paradox that Korea is struggling to solve, and the reality is far more exclusive than the numbers suggest. Okay, so let's just sit with that for a moment. That opening, it really lays out this huge contradiction.
It does. It's a powerful way to frame the whole issue.
You've got this official label, standard immigrant nation. It sounds so neat, so finalized.
Like a certificate you hang on the wall. Mission accomplished.
Exactly. Congratulations, you're now a modern, multicultural society.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have the reality of Eris in that tiny, windowless room.
And that tired, knowing smile he gives. That smile says everything, doesn't it?
It said he knows the certificate on the wall is just paper. He knows he's an economic unit, not a neighbor. That's the core tension we're diving into today, this clash between the label and the lived reality.
And we really have to start by defining our terms, because that label itself is, it's a bit of a bureaucratic construct. Last week, I sat through Ridley Scott's Napoleon with a friend who is, to put it mildly, a bit of a history buff. As the credits rolled, he wasn't just disappointed, he was visibly shaking with indignation. He butchered him, he kept muttering, as if the director had personally insulted a close relative. To my friend, Napoleon wasn't just a historical figure. He was an untouchable icon of French glory, a demigod of the battlefield who could do no wrong. But here's the funny thing about icons. When I asked my friend why he felt such a visceral connection to a man who lived 2 centuries ago, he didn't talk about the Napoleonic court or civil administration. He talked about strength, standing up to the world, and defending the soul of the nation. He saw a hero who rose from the ashes of the revolution to save France from its enemies. Then I mentioned the tiny awkward detail. Did you know this greatest Frenchman actually spent his youth hating France and fighting for his home island to break away from it? The man who eventually crowned himself emperor started his career as a separatist rebel trying to tear the country apart. My friend's face went blank for a second, then he immediately pivoted. While the times changed him, he had to be strong because everyone was against them. That's when it hit me. We love to talk about great men and their destiny, but Napoleon's rise wasn't just about his military genius. It was about a very specific, very dangerous kind of magic. The ability to turn a nation's fear of outsiders into a blank check for absolute power. He didn't just lead France, he hacked the French psyche. He was the original wolf warrior, realizing that the more enemies you have at the gates, the more the people will let you do whatever you want inside the palace. So, was Napoleon the savior of the revolution, or just a brilliant opportunist who knew how to use nationalism as a drug? To understand the man, we have to look past the epic movie posters and understand why, sometimes, a nation is willing to trade its hard-won freedom for the shadow of a crown.
It is a striking contradiction, isn't it? I was recently talking to a friend who was scrolling through a news feed, stopping on a headline about a series of routine naval exercises in a disputed strait. He shrugged and tossed his phone aside, saying, as long as they aren't actually shooting at each other, we're at peace. It's just posturing. To him, the world was a simple binary, a light switch that was either set to peace or war. But as I watched the footage of those destroyers cutting through the water, I realized he was missing the most terrifying part of the picture. He saw those ships as expensive props in a hollow theater.
Right, just for show.
Exactly. He didn't see that those vessels weren't just there. They were a specific sense in a very long, very calculated conversation. What struck me was how we've been conditioned to think of military force as a final resort, the end of diplomacy.
The absolute last thing that happens.
But in reality, the barrel of a gun is a tool of statecraft used with the precision of a scalpel, long before a formal declaration of war is ever signed. It's not a light switch, it's a sophisticated dimmer. A nation might turn up the intensity just a fraction of a decibel to see who flinches, or expand the scale of a border patrol just enough to signal that a map is being redrawn in real time.
And that dimmer analogy is, I think, the most important idea we'll talk about today.
When you look closely at the gray zone, the targeted drone strikes that punish without escalating, or the intentional airspace incursions designed to exhaust an enemy's nerves, you start to realize that peace is often just the lowest setting on a spectrum of violence.
It's not the absence of conflict, it's just the lowest intensity of conflict.
The logic of, it's okay to push as long as we don't break it, is a high-stakes gamble played every single day. This leads to a chilling question. If military action is a spectrum, how do we know when a warning has quietly shifted into a plan for total erasure?
And where is that line, that point of no return?
And at what point does a signal become a point of no return? To understand where the world is heading, we have to stop looking for the explosion and start measuring the heat.
That concept of measuring the heat rather than, waiting for the fire is the fundamental premise of what we need to discuss today. Our mission here really is to dismantle that binary view of peace versus war.
It's too simple.
It's a comfortable illusion, absolutely. But as the sources we have gathered demonstrate, it is an illusion that obscures the reality of modern statecraft. We need to look at conflict not as an on-off switch, but as a spectrum of constant manipulation.
And to do that effectively, we have gone through a significant amount of material.
A few days ago, I was speaking with a political analyst in Tokyo who described a peculiar sight in the halls of the Kantei. He spoke of Prime Minister Sanya Takeuchi, a leader who, on paper, looks absolutely untouchable. She's riding a wave of 70% public approval, the kind of numbers most politicians would give anything for. Yet, as he described her, there was this sense of a golden cage. Despite the cheering crowds outside, she spent her term shackled, forced to bargain with minor coalition partners just to move a single piece of legislation. She has the fame, but she doesn't have the room to breathe. What's fascinating is how she's chosen to break those bars. Instead of playing the slow game of diplomacy within her own party, she's decided to light the fuse on a political bombshell. On January 23rd, she plans to dissolve the House and trigger a snap election. It's a 60 billion yen gamble of taxpayer money at a time when the average Japanese family is already feeling the suffocating squeeze of inflation. The scene behind the scenes is even more tense. Word is that even the old guard of the LDP, veterans like Taro Aso, were left completely in the dark, watching from the sidelines as she launched this lightning war. To the public, she's framing this as a necessary stand against external threats, specifically the tightening grip of Chinese rare earth restrictions. She's painting a picture of a Japan that needs a strong hand to survive an economic Cold War. But there's a biting contradiction here that has everyone on edge. She is risking the very stability she claims to protect for a shot at absolute control. If she wins, she clears out the internal rivals and rules with an iron fist. If she loses, even by a few seats, the Takeuchi era could end before it truly begins, leaving the country in a leadership vacuum at its most vulnerable moment. It makes you wonder, is this a visionary leader securing her nation's future, or a high-stakes gambler who's finally decided to bet the house on herself?
It really is the definition of a high-stakes play, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, we're looking at a moment that could define not just her premiership, but potentially the whole trajectory of the Japanese state for the next decade or more.
It feels absolutely pivotal. We're recording this, just a few days before the planned dissolution, and the atmosphere you get from contacts in Tokyo is just incredibly charged.
You can feel it.
Yeah. And we have a massive amount of material to get through today to really unpack this gamble. I was recently looking through some footage from a tech hub in Shenzhen, and I saw something that, at first glance, looked like a total victory for labor rights. On December 4th, the workers at Yilishing Technology were told they were finally getting what the international community has been demanding for years, a strict 5 days, 8 hours schedule. No more grueling overtime, no more mandatory late nights. On paper, it was a dream of modern dignity. But as the announcement went out, the mood didn't lift. It shattered. Instead of cheers, there was a heavy, panicked silence. I saw reports of workers staring at their phones, frantically running numbers on calculator apps, their faces turning pale. They weren't celebrating their newfound free time. They were realizing they could no longer afford the rent. By the next morning, the factory gates were blocked. But this wasn't your typical strike for shorter hours. It was a mass of hundreds of people effectively demanding the right to be overworked again. It is a jarring, almost surreal contradiction. A legal work week that functions exactly like a predatory pay cut. To the company, this was compliance. To the workers, it felt like a soft layoff, a calculated strategy to make life so unaffordable that they would be forced to resign voluntarily, allowing the firm to dodge millions in severance pay. That instantaneous shift from the promise of a balanced life to the reality of a sub-survival wage leaves you with a deeply uncomfortable question. When following the law is used as a weapon to pressure the poor, where does the blame actually lie? Is this a case of a company playing a cynical shell game, or is it the sign of a governance system where the minimum wage is merely decorative? To understand what's really happening in Shenzhen, we have to look past the legal hours and into the logic of survival.
And that is it's the devastating paradox at the center of everything we're looking at today.
It really is.
And to really grasp the gravity of what you just described at Yilishing Technology, we have to zoom out a bit. We have to look at the entire economic engine of the Pearl River Delta.
Right. This isn't just one factory.
Not at all. What we are witnessing isn't just a single labor dispute.
Just a few months ago, Sanya Takeuchi stood before the press with a look of stoic determination, dismissing any talk of a snap election. She insisted her hands were full with economic policy, that there was no time for political maneuvering. It was the image of a leader focused solely on the grind of governance, seemingly indifferent to the power games of the diet. But fast forward to this week, and that same composure has transformed into something much more aggressive. A calculated lightning strike that has left the opposition scrambling in what they're calling a baseless raid on the status quo. On the surface, it looks like a standard political play. Dissolve the House of Representatives while your approval rating is sitting at a staggering 70%. It's the kind of opportunity any politician would find hard to resist. But as you look closer at the math she's doing, the target isn't just winning more seats, it's about a total structural bypass. Right now, she's tethered to coalition partners who are breathing down her neck, threatening to walk away and collapse her government if she doesn't meet their demands. She is, for the moment, a giant tied down by Lilliputians. However, there is a specific, almost hidden mechanism in the Japanese constitution she's betting the House on. It's called the superiority of the House of Representatives. If she can hit a very specific number 310 seats, the upper house, which currently stands as a fortress for the opposition, effectively ceases to exist in any meaningful way. She could pass a law, watch the upper house reject it, and then simply override them with a two-thirds majority. The shift from too busy for politics to dissolving parliament isn't just a change in schedule, it's a high-stakes gamble to transform from what critics called the weakest administration into a powerhouse comparable to the late Shinzo Abe. She isn't just looking for an election victory, she's looking to hollow out the very system that is supposed to keep her in check. The question is, will the Japanese public hand her the keys to an absolute monarchy, or is this the moment her 70% luck finally runs out?
And that question is hanging over everything in Tokyo right now. It is the political equivalent of putting all your chips on a single number at the roulette table.
A huge, huge gamble. But to really get why the wheel is spinning right now, we have to, ground ourselves in the timeline. The calendar here is everything.
It's incredibly compressed.
Right. Let's just set the scene. Today is Friday, January 30, 2026. And the air in Tokyo, you could almost feel it. It is absolutely electric.
It's tense. And it all happened so fast, the House of Representatives was dissolved just last week. I was at a small dinner party recently where a friend of mine, a high school teacher, was beaming with excitement. He'd just finished a side hustle and was bragging about how his smart investing and a perfectly timed mortgage refinance had finally given him some breathing room. He kept scrolling through his banking app, showing anyone who would look how his net worth had technically jumped over the last few years. There was this infectious energy in his voice, a feeling that despite the chaotic headlines, the average person was finally figuring out how to beat the system and come out ahead. But then the host mentioned the local school board's latest emergency meeting. Because of budgetary constraints and rising interest costs, they were slashing the music program and increasing class sizes. My friend's face dropped. In an instant, his pride and his personal wealth collided with the reality of his professional world. He started venting about how the money just isn't there anymore for the things that matter, seemingly unaware that the very mechanisms making his bank account look bigger on paper were the same ones hollowing out his classroom. It was a perfect, quiet snapshot of the trap we're all sitting in. Globally, we are staring at a $300 trillion debt mountain, a number so vast it has ceased to be money and has become a physical weight. We've spent years convinced we were getting a free lunch, fueled by printed trillions and near-zero rates that made borrowing feel like a gift. But the bill has finally landed on the table. Now the system is running out of tricks. We are being forced to choose between three bitter paths. Watching our savings vanish through inflation, watching our public services crumble through austerity, or watching the entire global engine seize up into default. We aren't waiting for the crisis to arrive. We're already in the middle of deciding which poison we're willing to swallow. That story, it just perfectly captures the weirdness of this moment, doesn't it? Imagine you're a trader in a dusty 7th century marketplace. For centuries, your people, the Arabs, have been the world's ultimate middlemen. You move silk, you tend sheep, and you worship a messy mosaic of local deities, Greek myths, and desert spirits. You have no unified flag, no grand army, and certainly no desire to conquer the horizon. You are the definition of minding your own business in the vast emptiness of the peninsula. But then, something happens that defies every rule of historical logic. A 40-year-old camel merchant, a man who can't even read or write, walks out of the cave claiming to hear the voices of angels. Suddenly, the unambitious shepherds undergo a total aesthetic rupture. They trade their ledgers for lances and their sheep for war horses. Within a single generation, they don't just challenge the superpowers of the day, the Persians and the Romans, they dismantle them. They build a caliphate that dwarfs the Roman Empire at its peak, stretching its green banners from the rainy hills of Spain all the way to the borders of Tang Dynasty China. It was, quite literally, the most successful and violent startup in human history. Yet here's the paradox. The same group of people who once translated Aristotle and pioneered algebra while Europe was in the dark now finds itself at a strange crossroads. When you look at the Arab Spring or the modern chaos of the Middle East, you see a civilization still haunted by that 7th century spark. The very religious zeal that once made them the masters of the medieval world now appears to be the one thing preventing them from entering the modern one. How did a group of unremarkable desert merchants become the world's most formidable conquerors overnight? And why has the formula for their greatest ancient victory become the blueprint for their modern struggle? Today, we peel back the mask to see the true face of the Arab world.
That's a powerful way to start. And that phrase, aesthetic rupture, really captures something essential. But, this startup analogy, while it's catchy, it's something we probably need to unpack a little.
I was thinking the same thing. It makes it sound almost clean, like a business plan.
In 1900, a lone monk wandering the Gobi Desert stumbled upon a hidden door sealed within the Mogao Caves. Behind it lay a library cave, untouched for nearly a millennium, packed floor to ceiling with 50,000 ancient scrolls. Among the mountain of manuscripts, one stood out, a perfectly preserved scroll from 868 AD. It wasn't just a religious text, it was the world's earliest dated printed book, created centuries before Gutenberg was even born. It was commissioned by a man named Wang Ji, not for profit or fame, but as a gift of universal free distribution to honor his parents. The text inside, the Diamond Sutra, is as sharp and unyielding as its namesake. It doesn't offer comfort in the way we usually expect from religion. Instead, it presents a dialogue between the Buddha and his disciple Subhuti that systematically deconstructs everything we think we know. It tells us that the self we protect is an illusion, that the objects we crave have no independent existence, and that the very words we are reading are merely rafts to be discarded once the river is crossed. What's truly striking is the central metaphor, a diamond. We usually think of diamonds as symbols of permanence and wealth, the ultimate thing to possess. But in this ancient text, the diamond is prized for its ability to cut. It is an indestructible blade meant to slice through our most stubborn misconceptions about reality. It challenges the listener to imagine a world where emptiness doesn't mean nothingness, but rather a profound, vibrating interconnectedness where nothing exists in isolation. How did a philosophy, this radical one that claims your very identity is a fragment of a larger, shifting web, become the foundation for entire civilizations across China, Japan, and Korea? And why did a man in the 9th century feel so compelled by these ideas that he used cutting-edge technology to ensure they would survive long after he was gone? To understand the Diamond Sutra is to look into a mirror and realize the person looking back isn't who you thought they were. I have to stop you there because the image you just painted, this library cave, it's hard for me to actually wrap my head around.
It is. I was grabbing coffee with an old college friend in Mumbai recently, a guy who spent his career navigating the brutal labyrinth of Indian import-export. He was staring at his phone, a strange, half-stunned smirk on his face. I just saw the new landed cost for shipment of German precision machinery, he told me. For 20 years, he'd been used to a world where European goods arrived with 110% ransom attached at the border, a price tag that basically said, stay out. But then he showed me the new invoice. That 110% had cratered to 10%. He wasn't celebrating, though. He looked almost suspicious. He leaned in and whispered, this isn't a sale. This is a panic. At the same time, half a world away in Brussels, the usual high-minded talk about shared democratic values and human rights benchmarks has gone curiously silent. Instead of lecturing, European officials are suddenly, almost frantically, signing off on 100,000 work permits for Indian engineers as if their industrial survival depended on it. It's a jarring reversal. For 2 decades, these two giants, the EU and India, treated each other like difficult, distant relatives. Suddenly, they're acting like survivors huddling together in a storm. The Atlantic Order, they both relied on for 70 years, is fracturing under the weight of American tariffs and internal decay, and the old rules of engagement have been tossed out the window. That instantaneous shift from 20 years of stubborn deadlock to a sudden desperate breakthrough leaves you wondering what changed. Why the sudden sprint to the finish line? The truth is, this isn't a celebration of free trade. It's a cold-blooded convergence of survival. To understand what's really happening, we have to look past the cheap Porsches and the Visas and see the raw industrial realism that is currently redrawing the map of the 21st century.
That phrase, a convergence of survival, really just hits the nail on the head. It perfectly captures the gravity of what we're seeing right now.
It does, because it's so easy to just see a headline about a trade deal and, your eyes glaze over. You think, okay, cheaper cars, maybe some electronics.
Cheaper toasters.
Yeah.
But this is something fundamentally different.
Last autumn, I found myself in a quiet village in the French countryside, sitting across from a cattle farmer named Jean-Pierre. When the topic of the new EU-Mercosur trade deal came up, the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Jean-Pierre didn't reach for a calculator or talk about market access. Instead, he pulled out a worn photo of his grandfather standing in the same fields they were working today. His voice was thick with a kind of quiet, vibrating resentment. To the people in Brussels, he said, pointing at the television, I'm just a rounding error, a cost to be optimized. He spoke about how the macroeconomic gains everyone kept celebrating felt like a slow-motion eviction notice for his community. To the urban consumer, the deal meant cheaper steak. To him, it meant the end of a 5-generation legacy. What was fascinating was how he didn't care about the GDP growth charts or the win-win rhetoric. He saw the world in winners and losers, and he knew exactly which side he was on. I asked him what he thought about the cheaper electronics and cars that the deal would bring. His face hardened. He didn't see the benefit of a cheaper smartphone if the cost was the soul of his town. He called it hush money for the dying. That total rejection of the all ships rise logic, the sheer intensity of his refusal to be a footnote in a spreadsheet, left me deeply unsettled. It made me realize that while free trade might win every argument on paper, it is losing the war in the streets. We have been told for decades that the adjustment is just temporary, a small price to pay for progress. But looking at Jean-Pierre, I saw that these adjustments have names, faces, and most importantly, votes. How did the theory that promises to make everyone richer end up fueling the greatest political fires of our century? Why does the math of globalization keep failing the reality of the people?
Hush money for the dying. I mean, wow.
Yeah.
That is a devastating phrase.
It is, isn't it? You stopped me in my tracks.
It completely cuts through all of the, the academic noise we usually hear, all the jargon around trade deals. What Jean-Pierre is describing there with that visceral clarity is what we in the field call distributive failure.
Imagine standing on a podium in ancient Athens. You've just won the highest honor, but instead of reaching for gold, you are handed a silver coin. To the ancient Greeks, silver was the true prize, harder to refine and more precious than the gold dust you could simply scoop out of a riverbed. It wasn't until 1904 at the St. Louis Olympics that gold finally claimed its spot as the ultimate aristocrat of metals, leaving copper behind as the commoner, the workhorse of factories and power lines. For decades, these metals have lived in a state of constant tension.
Right, the seesaw.
Exactly, the seesaw. When Dr. Copper is thriving because of a construction boom or an AI revolution, it signals a roaring economy, which typically sends the safe haven prices of gold and silver sliding back down. If one is winning the race, the others are usually lagging far behind. It is a reliable, predictable logic that investors have leaned on for a century.
It's financial physics, or what we thought was physics.
But right now, something incredibly strange is happening in the global markets. Something experts are calling an Olympic rally, and it is breaking every rule of financial physics. Copper has recently blasted past $13,000 a ton, fueled by a desperate global need for power grids and electric vehicles. Yet, instead of falling as the economy heats up, gold and silver are sprinting right alongside it, both smashing through their own all-time ceilings.
The whole podium is rising together. It shouldn't happen.
And to visualize the sheer scale of this anomaly, consider this. A single 1-kilogram bar of gold, something you can easily hold in one hand, now carries the exact same market value as 12 metric tons of copper.
That's the image that sticks with you.
It does. An entire heavy-duty construction truck, overflowing with industrial metal, matched against a small yellow brick. This simultaneous explosion of the aristocrats and the commoner is a rare, synchronized surge that shouldn't exist. It has left the financial world stunned and deeply curious. Is this Olympic rally the start of a golden age for infrastructure, or is the market signaling a contradiction that could lead to a massive, unexpected collapse?
That image, the truck versus the brick, it really puts the entire situation into such sharp focus, doesn't it?
It does. I was sitting in a high-end steakhouse in D.C. last week, the kind of place where the wine is aged longer than most tech startups, and the air smells like expensive leather and quiet confidence. At the table next to me, a lobbyist was practically radiant. He was clinking glasses with a group of colleagues, celebrating a massive new legislative win. To him, the trillions of dollars being moved through the federal budget were just numbers on a scoreboard, proof that the machine was still humming. He kept checking a digital ticker on his phone, saw the markets were green, and ordered another round of $400 scotch with a smirk that said the party would never end. He was living in the high summer of the virtual world, where credit is infinite and the Federal Reserve is a magic wand. But then the waiter arrived. He didn't have the scotch. Instead, he had this look of genuine panicked confusion. He leaned in and whispered that their primary steak supplier had just refused their latest credit payment. They weren't accepting the restaurant's corporate line anymore. They were demanding immediate physical settlement in a different asset class. Right at that moment, the lobbyist's phone buzzed with a breaking news alert. Gold had just cleared $5,200. The silence that hit that table was deafening. The giddy excitement evaporated in a heartbeat, replaced by a gray, hollow-eyed stare. It was the look of a man who suddenly realized that his entire portfolio, his entire world, was built on a stack of IOUs that the rest of the planet had decided to stop honoring. He started frantically scrolling, looking for an economic data point, a Fed statement, anything to prove the old logic still held. But the math was finally refusing to lie. That moment wasn't just a market fluctuation, it was a funeral. We are witnessing the physical autopsy of the dollar. It is the moment the monetary phantom finally met its physical reckoning, revealing a West that traded its industrial heart for financial parasitism. While we were busy perfecting the art of the speculative bubble, a new Eurasian order was quietly anchoring itself in the unforgiving reality of resources and production. Why did the virtual empire fail so spectacularly? And why is the rise of gold not just a price spike, but the ultimate vote of no confidence in a dying civilization?
Wow, that's a powerful way to frame it. The imagery is incredibly stark. But, I have to pull back from the ledge just for a second.
Go for it.
We've heard death of the dollar stories for, 20 years now? Every single time there's a debt ceiling fight, or every time gold ticks up a few $100, you hear the screams about the end of the world.
Right. It becomes the background noise after a while.
Exactly. And yet the dollar is still the global reserve currency. It's still, in many ways, at record highs against the euro. So I guess before we declare this an autopsy, we really have to ask, is that lobbyist in the State House, is he actually seeing a real structural break in the system, or is this just another panic cycle?
Another Tuesday in the markets.
Right, because if we're going to make the claim that the virtual empire is failing, we need to go beyond the sentiment, beyond that hollow-eyed stare, and look at the actual mechanics, what's happening in the plumbing.
I was recently speaking with a professor at a major research university who was practically glowing as he described his newest doctoral candidate, a brilliant young engineer from Shanghai. He called the kitty once-in-a-generation talent, the kind of mind that wins patents and fuels billion-dollar breakthroughs. To the professor, this is the American dream in action, the world's best and brightest flocking to our shores to build the future. But then the conversation took a sharp, uncomfortable turn. I asked if the student had arrived on campus yet, and the professor's face fell. His excitement vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, helpless frustration. It turns out the student's visa had been frozen indefinitely. The reason? Not a criminal record or a security threat, but a handful of reposts on a social media account from 3 years ago. Suddenly, the future of American innovation was being treated like a digital insurgent. The professor started venting, his voice dropping to a whisper, as if he were sharing a state secret. He complained that while we lecture the world about the marketplace of ideas, we've started checking ideological IDs at the door. He told me, we're starving our own labs to win a political argument that nobody's even winning. That jarring shift from celebrating global talent to watching it get strangled by our own red tape is becoming the new American standard. We claim to be the beacon of the free world, yet in April 2025 we pulled the plug on thousands of student visas, demanding total access to their digital lives while punishing dissent. It's a policy framed as national security, but when you look closer, it looks a lot more like a self-inflicted wound. We are currently witnessing a historic paradox. The United States is systematically dismantling the very soft power that made it a superpower, all while preaching the freedoms it is no longer willing to practice. And that story right there.
A few nights ago, I found myself standing on the edge of Sinicity Square in Kabukicho, watching a girl who couldn't have been older than 16. She was sitting on a flattened cardboard box, surrounded by a fortress of convenience store plastic bags, scrolling through her phone with an expression of pure, unadulterated boredom. To a casual observer, she looked like a symbol of ultimate rebellion, someone who had successfully escaped the suffocating pressure of Japanese society to live by her own rules in the neon heart of Shinjuku. There was an almost enviable air of freedom about the group she was with. They were loud, they were messy, and they seemed to own the pavement. I watched a passing businessman stop to give them some change, his face a mask of pitying kindness. For a moment, it felt like a strange sort of harmony, the rigid world of the salaryman acknowledging the chaotic, liberated world of the Toyoko kids. It looked like a social safety valve working in real time. But then the atmosphere shifted instantly. A heavy police van pulled up, its red lights pulsing against the damp asphalt. I expected a scene of defiance, a cinematic stand for their way of life. Instead, the girl didn't even look up at first. When the officers began systematically dismantling their makeshift camp, she didn't fight or scream about her rights. She just stood up, shouldered her backpack, and looked at the officers with a chillingly blank stare. The businessman, who had been so charitable moments before, didn't stay to help or protest. He actually stepped back, smoothed his suit, and watched the sweep with a faint, satisfied nod, as if he were watching a janitor finally arrive to clean a particularly stubborn stain. That sudden transition from a scene of supposed social rebellion to a clinical exercise in urban sanitation left me struck. It made me realize that what we call freedom in these urban pockets might just be the visible symptom of a state that has temporarily lost its will to enforce order. And as the square cleared, the real question wasn't where those kids would go, but what happens to a civilization when it decides that order is no longer a requirement, but an option.
Wow. That is a hell of an opening image. A few months ago, I was reading a report about a multi-billion-dollar arms deal that never happened. On paper, it was a straightforward transaction between two sovereign nations. No U.S. involvement, no U.S. territory. But as soon as the wire transfer was initiated, it essentially vanished. It wasn't lost. It was intercepted by a bank in New York I had to pass through for a split second just to clear the currency. In that moment, Washington didn't just see the transaction, they killed it. It's a scene that plays out more often than you'd think, and it's exactly why the recent moves by the BRICS nations feel less like a dry economic policy and more like a high-stakes military maneuver. When you hear the term de-dollarization, most people imagine it's about making it cheaper to ship soybeans or oil. You might picture bureaucrats in suits arguing over currency conversion fees. But if you look closer at the financial firewall, they're building systems like CIPS and SPFS. The atmosphere changes. It's too robust, too redundant, and far too opaque to just be about trade efficiency. There's a common theory that these alternative payment rails are just a side effect of wanting a more diverse global market. But the reality is much more calculated. If you want to sell a battery of S-400 missiles or collaborate on a new generation of drone technology, you don't need a faster way to pay. You need a way to pay that is invisible to the eyes in Manhattan and Brussels. The logic is simple. A general-purpose secret financial network isn't just a way to bypass the dollar, it is the world's most powerful arms trading network. It makes you wonder, are they building a new global economy, or are they forging a shield specifically to protect their swords? That gives you chills, right?
I was sitting across from a friend at a high-end cafe in Bangalore recently. He's 34, a senior manager at a tech firm, and he had just parked his brand new SUV outside. On the surface, he is the poster child for the new India. But as he sipped his artisanal latte, he wasn't talking about his career trajectory or his upcoming trip to Europe. Instead, he showed me a grainy, yellowed photo on his phone, a picture of his childhood living room from 1992. In the photo, there was a single rotary phone on a wooden stool and a bulky, shutter-style television. "My father worked one job for 35 years, he said, his voice carrying a strange mix of envy and exhaustion. He never owned a car like mine, but he also never checked his email at 11 p.m. I have everything he dreamed of, yet I feel like I'm suffocating under the weight of it all." The contradiction was jarring. Just moments later, his father called to remind him to save every paisa and stay humble, while simultaneously a notification popped up from his global director in London demanding a disruptive, high-growth strategy by morning. He looked at the phone, then at me, looking completely drained. He was trapped between the work first, enjoy later values of a socialist, scarcity-driven past and the growth at all costs demands of a hyper-capitalist present. That quiet moment of burnout in a loud, expensive cafe perfectly captures the silent crisis of India's Gen Y. They are the bridge generation, the ones who grew up in the analog shadows of landlines and scooters only to be catapulted into a digital world of 10% real estate inflation and global competition. They are expected to be the obedient, traditional children their Gen X parents recognize, while being the aggressive, innovative professionals the modern market demands. No generation in history has been asked to carry two such fundamentally different worlds at once. But as the debt rises and the mental health statistics climb, we have to ask, at what point does the bridge finally break?
That's such a powerful opening. That image, the rotary phone versus the smartphone notification.
The other day, I was scrolling through recent headlines about the latest diplomatic shifts when I came across a photograph from the recent summit in Saudi Arabia. In it, the air of transformation was almost palpable, whispers of a grand bargain, a 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine, and a sudden, unexpected warmth radiating from Washington toward Moscow. It felt as if the rigid geopolitical tectonic plates we've lived with for years were suddenly, violently beginning to slide. To a casual observer, it looks like the ultimate reversal. You see the headlines about Trump's phone calls to Putin and Marco Rubio's surprising nods toward multipolarity, and you start to wonder, is the no-limits partnership between China and Russia about to hit its limit? There's this persistent, almost romanticized anxiety in some circles, the idea that Russia, at its core, is a Western civilization just waiting for the right excuse to leap back into Europe's embrace and leave Beijing standing alone. But when you look closer, past the high-stakes optics of a Saudi summit, the reality feels much more clinical, even cold. I was talking with an expert who has spent years analyzing this triangle over rounds of vodka in Moscow and strategy sessions in Shanghai. He observed these frantic diplomatic maneuvers not with panic, but with a kind of detached, skeptical curiosity. He pointed out a glaring contradiction. While Washington talks of peeling Russia away from China, the structural reality is that the US and Russia are actually fierce competitors in the one thing that keeps the Kremlin's lights on: energy. The giddy excitement over a potential grand bargain starts to look a lot like a fragile script that ignores the lack of mutual trust and the absence of any real economic glue. It raises a haunting question. Is this new triangle a masterstroke of 21st century realism, or is it a pursuit of a grand deal that neither side has the leverage or the time to actually deliver?
And that, I think, is the central question we have to dig into today. It's a fascinating and, frankly, very seductive narrative that's taking hold.
It is. It's everywhere. This idea of a grand pivot.
Yeah. I was scrolling through Chinese social media recently, and I stumbled upon a debate that felt less like a history lesson and more like, well, like a fever dream.
Oh.
Yeah. People were obsessing over the year 1644. And they were arguing with this incredible intensity that if the Ming Dynasty hadn't fallen to the man's shoes, China would be leading the world in semiconductor technology today.
You're kidding. Semiconductors.
I'm not joking. There were these viral clips claiming the secret to modern lithography was essentially lost during the Qing takeover.
Wow.
It was this raw, giddy hand-centrism that looked, on the surface like exactly the kind of red-hot nationalism we're told Beijing loves to cultivate.
Right. The kind of thing you'd expect them to amplify.
Exactly. But then the mood just shifted instantly. The state media didn't join the cheers. Instead, they published this chillingly stern warning. And they didn't just call these ideas inaccurate. They labeled this 1644 historiography a dangerous political risk that needed to be dismantled.
A political risk? That's a very specific and heavy term in their vocabulary.
It's a bizarre sight if you think about it. We're used to seeing anti-Japanese dramas on Chinese TV where soldiers perform these physics-defying stunts to defeat foreign devils. That's content. The government seems perfectly happy to let slide.
Sure. That's the external enemy. It's a safe target.
Right. Yet, when the enemy is a dynasty from 400 years ago, the censors move in with this cold, calculated precision. So why is Beijing so terrified of a historical what-if?
That is the core question, isn't it?
If you look at a country like India, the government there actually leans into this kind of thing. They're tearing down the legacy of foreign rulers to fire up the majority.
Right.
But in China, the logic is completely reversed. Turns out that for the CCP, nationalism isn't a fire to be fed, it's a faucet to be turned.
On and off very carefully.
And as we're about to see, the same government that lets you vent your anger at a history of external enemies will move ruthlessly to silence you the moment you start picking at the stitches of the modern Chinese map. This isn't just about history. It's about a regime that is, perhaps, more allergic to its own people's nationalism than we ever realized.
It is a profound observation. Imagine you're watching a high-stakes dance performance. One dancer is all sharp, aggressive movements, pure energy and light, while the other is fluid, silent, and retreating into the shadows. At first, it looks like a fight, a struggle for dominance where one must eventually crush the other. But then you notice something strange. The aggressive dancer only has momentum because the fluid one gives way, and the silent dancer only has a shape because of the light provided by the other. They aren't fighting at all, they're keeping each other alive. Most of us look at the world as a series of either-ors. You're either successful or a failure, the world is either chaotic or orderly, and you're either the one pushing forward or the one being pushed. We treat these opposites like enemies at war. But thousands of years ago, during a period of relentless conflict known as the Warring States in China, philosophers looked at the same chaos and saw something completely different. They didn't see a battle to be won. They saw a taiji, a great pole, where every force, no matter how dark, carried the seed of its own opposite. They called it yin and yang. It's a concept we've turned into a trendy symbol on t-shirts and yoga mats, often dismissed as a simple cliche about balance. But when you look closer at the Book of Changes, or the ancient practice of Chinese medicine, you realize this isn't just a passive observation. It's a radical way of deconstructing reality. It suggests that your greatest strength is actually the source of your deepest weakness, and that within your most crushing defeat lies the precise blueprint for your next victory. So why did an ancient civilization decide that binary thinking was a trap? And how does this 2,000-year-old dance of opposites actually explain everything from the way you breathe to the strange behavior of subatomic particles in a quantum lab? To understand the harmony, we first have to understand the friction.
That's a really powerful way to frame this whole discussion, that idea of the dance. Because I think most of us, especially in the West, we see the symbol, the taijutsu, and we just think balance. You know, a little bit of good, a little bit of bad. I was scrolling through some travel vlogs the other day and came across this clip of the guy on a train platform in Shanghai. He wasn't a tourist. He looked like a mid-level engineer, maybe in his late 40s, clutching a briefcase. As the CR450 test model pulled into the station, this sleek, almost predatory-looking machine designed to hit 450 kilometers per hour, his entire demeanor changed. He didn't just watch it. He stared at it with this intense, quiet pride, nodding to himself as if he were checking off a personal victory. When the vlogger asked him why he was so focused, he didn't talk about travel times or ticket prices. He leaned in and said, in the West, they talk about wealth in terms of numbers on a screen. But look at this. This is physics. You can't fake 450 kilometers per hour with a central bank printing press. To him, that train wasn't just transportation. It was a physical audit of national competence. It was proof that while other countries were arguing over legal filings and interest rate minutes, his country was busy mastering the laws of thermodynamics. But then the conversation took a sharp turn. The vlogger mentioned a recent news report about a major infrastructure project in a Western capital, a subway line that had been delayed for 12 years and gone 5 times over budget due to environmental lawsuits and local zoning disputes. The engineer's expression shifted from pride to a kind of detached, almost pitying amusement. He let out a short, dry laugh and said, "That is the price of a system that gives everyone a no, but gives no one a yes. They have all the money in the world, yet they can't even move a mountain anymore." That shift in his voice, from the thrill of seeing a high-speed marvel to that quiet realization of a neighbor's paralysis, really stuck with me. It highlighted a gap that goes way deeper than GDP or trade balances. It made me wonder, if one society is obsessed with the abstract flow of finance and the other is obsessed with the physical flow of mass and energy, which one is actually building the future? Is $1 trillion in a bank account worth anything if you've lost the civilizational muscle required to actually build a train?
Wow, that's a powerful way to start. It just cuts right to the heart of the matter, doesn't it?
It really does. It's not about economics anymore. It feels like it's about reality, a clash of two different realities.
That's exactly it. And that is the mission for this deep dive. We're going to try and step away from the usual noise, the market fluctuations, the politics.
The day stuff.
Exactly.